Hello, and welcome back to the Elevate Your Running podcast. I'm here this week with Jason Fitzgerald, and I'm really excited about this topic because today we're going to talk all about the Boston Marathon and the 2025 cutoff, as well as the new qualifying standards. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Going great, Sarah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for making the time. I really appreciate it. Before we get into today's topic, I'd love to go through our elevated moments, and I'm going to let you kick it off this week.
Oh, my elevated moment. Well, I just had an interesting experience going down to the Cayman Islands for a type of running camp. And we underdid some testing that when we were down there, which was really interesting. So I did some force plate testing and a VO2 max test. And my elevated moment is that I scored a 66 on my VO2 max test, which I was a little surprised. I was hoping for anything over 60. I tested at a 69.1 back in 2008 when I was running a lot more. I was capable of much faster finish times. So it was really nice to see that my VO2 max hasn't actually declined very much in the last 16 years.
That's pretty cool.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. As someone who is training a lot right now, I am leaning into all the data, so it's pretty cool. Like knowing on the other side of this, on the other side of training, you can still kind of have some really good data to support just your overall maybe wellness and athleticism.
For sure. I mean, VO2 max is such a good longevity marker. You basically want it as high as possible because it is going to decline about 10% per decade. And, if you're starting from a high peak, that just means you have more wiggle room in your physiology to continue declining. Because at a certain point, if your VO2 max is low enough, and let's say you're 80 or 90 years old, it's not going to be high enough for you to walk up a flight of stairs. So you're going to get winded, and that's going to feel like you racing a mile at that point in your life. So it's a really good thing to try to get really high, as well as, once you're done, quote unquote, training hard, even just a little bit of aerobic exercise is going to go a long way to helping maintain that number. So that's essentially what I've been doing over the last 9 years is, I'm still running 30 to 40 miles a week. And that's been enough to really slow the decline of that VO2 max number.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think if we're looking in the future when we're 80 and 90 years old, we all want to be climbing stairs and doing things that we want to do, maybe more so in our control than our body kind of giving us that control or telling us what to do. So for everyone out there training right now, you're doing great things now and in the future. Um, well, I'm glad you had a great weekend. Sounds like a pretty incredible experience. And I think you're promoting this weekend or talking more about this weekend on your podcast and YouTube channel.
Yeah, I am going to be putting up a video of my VO2 max test. We were able to get some footage. So anyone who's interested in actually watching me suffer through a VO2 max test, you're going to be able to see that on Strength Running's YouTube channel. And in a couple weeks, I'm going to have the sports scientist who did the test for me on the podcast to talk a little bit more about what we were testing, what's the value of a VO2 max test, because it's honestly not actually very indicative of your performance.
Mhm.
Um, you know, Elliot Kipchoge didn't have the fastest or the highest VO2 max, rather, in the breaking two group. Other runners had a higher VO2 max, yet he was the fastest marathoner. And so there's other issues at play, but nevertheless, it's still a really good metric to track.
Absolutely. It sounds like a whole other episode, one that you recorded on your own podcast. And yeah, it's a really cool topic and really excited to hear all about it on the Strength Running podcast. My elevated moment of the week is definitely Boulderthon, piggybacking off of last week. And last week's elevated moment, knowing the weekend was going to be really great and going through the experience of the Boulderthon weekend, which is a 5K, 10K half marathon race in Boulder, Colorado. It's their third year. It's grown to incredible numbers. There were over 10,000 runners on Sunday, and the Elevate team had a really strong team show up to not only race, but also have a lot of fun. And it was just such a good feel good weekend from the shakeout run that I participated in on Friday night, going to another run on Saturday morning, connecting with a lot of runners in the area. And then, of course, helping support my team as some raced, some fun run the course. And it was a warm morning. The course is very difficult. Whether you're running the 5K, 10K, half or full, you're climbing pretty significantly in the second half of all of those races at altitude. But it was a lot of fun. And for someone who loves running, I found this weekend to be a weekend where I loved it even more at the end of the weekend, if that makes sense. It was just so great to be immersed in the running community. So cheers to everyone who was there. And I know they're planning on a fourth year next fall, so stay tuned for more info on that. I don't think they released the date quite yet.
And a quick shout out to the race founder, Phil Dumonted. I had him on my podcast a couple weeks ago to talk about like what he does as the CEO of a company that owns many races.
Yeah.
And he's done a really excellent job with putting on Boulderthon. And I think one of the reasons why it's just such an amazing weekend experience is because it is a race that also celebrates the city of Boulder.
Mhm.
And, if you live in or near Boulder, or you just like Boulder, I met some people who travel to Boulder just to experience some running up there because it's so beautiful. It is a great destination race just to experience running near the Flatirons, and it's just beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. And Phil's an awesome human. And shout out to Phil for a great weekend. All right, let's get into this week's episode. We're talking all about Boston, and I figured why not have Jason on the podcast? He's run Boston, I've run Boston, and I think it's going to be a really great conversation. So, the Boston or the BAA announced that the cutoff time for the 2025 season or year is 6 minutes and 51 seconds, which is the highest cutoff time since the pandemic. The only year that was higher was the pandemic year, which was, I believe, 7 minutes and 47 seconds, which was the pandemic year. It was a smaller field. And so we're seeing the Boston Marathon year over year have these pretty incredible cutoff times. Jason, what does the cutoff time mean for people who are either familiar or unfamiliar with it? What does it mean?
Yeah, so there's two numbers that are really important when it comes to the Boston Marathon. There's the qualifying standard, or the qualifying time that you have to hit, and then there's the cutoff time. So the qualifying standard is what most of us are familiar with. I think they just moved the fastest standard for 25 to 35-year-old men to, I think, 2:55 in the marathon. So that's your minimum that you have to hit to even potentially be considered to get into the race. Now, you have qualified for the Boston Marathon at that point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be able to register for the Boston Marathon. And that's where the cutoff time comes in. The cutoff time is a reflection on how many people are trying to register for the race, or the number of applicants that they have. And so if they have a lot of applicants for the marathon, essentially too many people that they can actually put on the race course on the day, because there are limitations, they're going to have to reduce the number of people that they have. So they institute a cutoff time, essentially almost like another qualifying time. It's lower than the actual qualifying time, and it helps to normalize the number of applicants that they have, or the number of registrants that they expect to have. So, if they have a potential field size of 35,000 and 45,000 people register for the marathon because they've met the qualifying time, well, they're going to have to reduce that field size. And they do that by implementing that cutoff time. And like you said, it's been higher in the past at some points. It's also been zero in the past. I think 2021 or 22, maybe 2023, I'd have to go back and check. There were years where there was no cutoff time. So if you made the qualifying standard, you're in, and you're able to register successfully for the Boston Marathon. But some years, hey, the Boston Marathon is very popular. It's considered the world's most prestigious marathon. So there's definitely going to be, a lot of interest in the marathon.
Definitely. Yeah. I was on maybe both sides of the spectrum. I qualified in 2021, which was the pandemic year. The cutoff time was 7 minutes and 47 seconds. The field was quite a bit lower. Like it was just a smaller group of people running because of the pandemic. And then I went back in 2023 and there was a zero, like the cutoff was zero. Everyone who applied got in. And that made it a lot of fun because there was a big group of Elevate runners who went, and we made it just a really fun race experience. Do you think that this cutoff time for 2025 and now the qualifying standard change for 2026, do you think it's going to make it easier or harder to qualify for Boston?
Do you mean harder to qualify at some point in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think what we're seeing in the running community is that community evolving and growing over time. I do think that there are more people running marathons now than there were 10 or 20 years ago. But we've also seen a lot of advancements in technology. And I think the two biggest ones have been number one, on the fueling side of things. We're now fueling a lot better for marathons than we did 10 or 15 years ago with more carbohydrate. The science of carb loading and fueling during marathons is now much more robust. And we understand that, hey, we can actually take in and benefit from more carbs. And we're also now using carbon plated super shoes. When I ran my marathon PR back in 2011, I didn't wear, fancy foam shoes with a carbon plate in them. And now that runners are fueling better, they are wearing these super shoes that have a clear and definitive performance benefit, as well as just I think more runners understand the training process for marathons at this point. They can hire a coach like you or a coach like me, and coaching is now much more accessible to runners.
Mhm.
And so I think what we're seeing is that the qualifying standards are getting more competitive because runners are getting more competitive.
Mhm.
There's more competition at these higher levels of marathoning. And it sort of is going back to the historical norm where, I think in the 1980s, you had to run under 250 to get into the Boston Marathon. And so we're starting to get back into, a phase of time where the standards are more competitive, marathoners are more competitive on the whole. So it's a tough question. Like, is it harder to get into Boston? I mean, objectively, 100%. The standard is now faster. But
Yeah.
there's more access to coaching, super shoes, better training, carb loading strategies. So, yes, it's objectively harder to train and qualify for Boston, but I also think it's never been an easier time to run a faster marathon.
That's a great answer. I love that. I love that it's faster. And I know that that comment probably isn't going to sit well with a lot of people, but I love that it's faster. I love working hard. I love like going to the limits of your potential, and like let's if you're qualifying and going to Boston, let's have it be like the best of the best in the field, because that's really what Boston is. We saw a surge of runners hit the pavement during the pandemic. This was in 2020, 2021. Do you think that all of those runners who have had 4 or 5 years of training in their training toolkit, like have they maybe impacted these standards at all, or these cutoff times?
Yeah, I think that's a great theory, Sarah. Whenever there's an event that causes a big influx of runners into the running scene, I think it stands to reason that's probably going to increase, the pressures on every aspect of the community. There's going to be more people at
Mhm.
races. There's going to be more people buying shoes. There's also going to be more people who discover that they are very talented. So you might have someone who was never really interested in running, but they got into it during the pandemic because they had nothing better to do. And then all of a sudden, oh wow, they're actually quite talented. And they've discovered that they have, some genetic
Mhm.
ability, and they've started going after that ability. They've started training consistently, and now they're a Boston qualifier. So I think it, simply by allowing more people to experience the sport, you're going to experience more of everything. Yeah, there's going to be more back of the packers, there's going to be more middle of the packers, and there's going to be more folks at the front who have either trained really hard over the last 4 to 5 years, or have discovered the fact that, hey, I actually may be harboring some hidden talent that I didn't know about.
Yeah, which is really exciting. I think I've seen a surge in running, I've seen a surge in training, and it's really fun. It's really fun to see people out there working hard, working after their goals, maybe hitting that qualifying standard, maybe being a few minutes or a few seconds off and having this like drive inside them to keep going and see what they can do in the next race. To break this down really quickly, what do these qualifying standards mean for 2026? So, if you are a 21 to 34-year-old male, you'll need to run at least a 255, like Jason said, which is a 640 pace average. And for a female, you need a 325, which is a 750 average. For masters runners like Jason and I, a 40 to 44-year-old male needs to run a 305, which is a 704 average. And then a female who is 40 to 44 needs a 335, which is an 810 average. So they have increased the standard by 5 minutes, and it's faster per gender, per age group, which roughly equates to about 10 seconds per mile, which is a lot of time, right, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at 10 seconds a mile. That can be a significant margin of improvement for what you're looking at yourself personally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be really hard. I recently got an email from someone who, one of my athletes that I was working with, and they're just ready for their fall marathon. It was right after these standards came out, and they were trying to go for a BQ, and they realized, oh, now I need to run even faster than I thought. Should I just go for it? And I know that can be really tempting for a lot of runners, but if you think you are ready for a 302, 303, 304 marathon, and all of a sudden they change the standard, that doesn't mean you should just go for a 255. You are going to crash and burn. Your
Yeah.
physiology is not ready for that. You're not trained for that. You haven't been preparing for that. And so, it is more than you think. Even just going 5 minutes faster, if you're even a moderately trained athlete and you sort of know where your marathon time is likely going to end up within a, relatively small window of maybe, 4 to 6 minutes or so on race day, now's not the time just to go for the new time or the new cutoff period because you think that's what you need. Yeah, that is what you need, but it's not what you're ready for right now.
Yeah, that's really great advice because these standards and the new qualifying time came out, right before fall race season. And I know I'm coaching quite a few people who are going after a BQ and talking with them and strategizing on, can they do this? Is it something that they were, prepared to do anyways before these standards were announced? Or is it something that we have to say, we got to stick to the plan because we don't want to crash and burn. 10 seconds is actually quite a bit of time per mile. And if you think of it, adding it up over 26.2 miles, you will crash and burn. Absolutely. As someone who has gone out 10 seconds too fast per mile in my second marathon, which was the Boston Marathon in 2021, I crashed and burned at mile 10. And it doesn't feel good because at that point you have 16 miles to grind through. And on that course, it's like the hardest 16 to grind through. And what you can do is set yourself up for success by following the plan, using this marathon as a stepping stone, going back to the drawing board and saying, what do I need to do for the next year to maybe qualify for Boston next fall or in 12 months? And, usually that looks like going back to speed and not necessarily racing another marathon in the spring. Do you have any other like tips or advice for someone who is going into the fall race season, maybe they have 8 weeks left in their training. At the time of this recording, we're about 8 weeks out from CIM. Marine Corps, Indy, Philly, it's starting to wind down quite a bit. And we're in kind of in peak training for those races. But for someone who is doing maybe a late fall marathon like CIM, which is typically the first Sunday in December, I know Tucson is the second Sunday in December. Is there anything that those runners could do now to try and like excel their fitness and training, or do they just get to be patient?
Well, yeah, I think tip number one is to be patient. With 8 weeks to go until your race, you probably have a 2 week taper. So that really means you only have about 6 weeks of training time left. And you obviously don't want to run substantially higher weekly mileage than you ever have before. You don't want to all of a sudden double the intensity of your workouts or dramatically increase your long runs. In other words, you don't want to do anything that's just going to get you hurt, because running is this cumulative type of sport where what you do today helps you do something next week, and what you do next week helps you build on that the following month. And so you really can only build on what you've been recently doing. And so because of that, you can't really do anything dramatically different with your training. So there is this very big uh, inclination or temptation to maybe do something that wouldn't be a great idea. That the running coaches that are having this conversation right now, Sarah, would be like, yeah, let's not do anything too silly. Let's stick to the plan for the most part. But there are a couple things that you might want to do that could help bring your performance to another level that wouldn't be super stressful. So for example, one thing that I like to see is, if you have this progression of long runs planned, you may want to include a little bit of quality during those long runs, particularly maybe in the second half of that long run, because that's when you're going to be more tired. It's going to be more specific to the marathon, and it is going to be more stressful because of that. You're on tired legs, you're maybe in a slightly carb depleted state. And so practicing marathon pace in the second half of a long run could be a really valuable way of making those long runs a little bit more valuable to your eventual marathon performance. Another thing that I might recommend is starting a very simple plyometric program just to develop a little bit more efficiency. If you can improve your economy, it's not always about building a bigger aerobic base of fitness. That's obviously probably the most important thing for a marathoner. But another thing that we can do is work on your running economy. Your running economy, especially in a marathon, I think is really important because of how long the race is. And because it's almost always on the roads, we're not usually talking about trail marathons. The potential for improvement just by improving your economy can be fairly large. Maybe that is that 5 to 10 seconds a mile that we're talking about. Maybe you can get that just by incorporating some plyometrics, some hopping, some even jump rope, something like that, just to develop a little bit more stiffness in your tendons, especially in the calf and Achilles tendon, in that area of the posterior chain, can be really helpful because you're just going to develop a little bit more efficiency and economy. And that means, you're going to be able to run a little bit faster at the same effort. So while on the one hand, I am very cautious about adding too many different things that weren't in your original plan, I think these could be helpful. And then, of course, we can talk about maybe you just fuel really well for your marathon. If you don't really have a fueling strategy, building out a very robust fueling strategy is going to help you maximize your fitness on race day. So it's not going to give you extra fitness, but it's going to allow you to fully express the fitness that you do have.
Absolutely. I love that. I say to my athletes, like, gel well, gel often. Like, go out there, let's practice this in training, let's take in as much fuel as our stomach will allow, and sodium. I think that's a fine like balancing act of making sure you're not losing too many electrolytes as you're running 3, 4, 4.5, 5 hours out there, and feeling the benefits of it in training. Because if you can feel confident in all of those things throughout the training process, you're more likely going to execute it well on race day, and it's going to build that confidence throughout the race too.
Yeah, I'm more interested in like what you can do if you want to run a qualifying time a year from now, because then that means you basically, so you have a year.
Hmm.
You can break that down into, I think, three distinct seasons. So you could have a winter, spring season, then you could have like a spring, summer season, and then you have that summer, fall marathon training season. And
Yeah.
so, okay, you're obviously going to train for a marathon in the summer and fall as you get ready for that fall marathon. But what should you do during the first two seasons that you have after this fall marathon? That to me is the most interesting question, because there's more opportunity for improvement if you can get really strategic with those two seasons.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Let's dive into that. So what can runners do and how can they structure, like what do the winter and the spring seasons look like for someone who is maybe a few minutes off that BQ, or, for someone who has 5 or 7 minutes to take off?
Yeah, so I think, this really goes to this concept that I've been talking more and more about called the season before the season, where if you want to have a breakthrough, you can't just have one good season. Like, yeah, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough for some improvement. But if we're really talking a breakthrough, which a 7-minute improvement in the marathon, I think is kind of a breakthrough
Mhm.
performance, then we really need the season before the season to be a really good season too. And so I've found a lot of marathoners, particularly those folks who love Boston and really want that qualifying time. One of the things that they do is they kind of just train for marathon after marathon after marathon. And they do 2 marathons a year, sometimes three. I like to have them step back from the marathon for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're going to do different training. Let's say you train for a 5K or a 10K, and you give it as much care and attention just as you do with the marathon. Most folks don't do that. Most, oh, it's only 3.1 miles or 6.2 miles. I don't need to train for that. It's like, well, you don't need to train to complete it, but you do need to train to run it really fast. And that's really our goal. We want to drive personal bests in the middle distances. That is going to expose us to new types of training. It's going to improve our turnover, our foot speed. It's going to improve our VO2 max. We're probably going to build extra running economy. And there's really only three ways to become a faster athlete. You improve your VO2 max, you improve your lactate threshold, or you improve your running economy. And you can improve your running economy and VO2 max, which are two of the three legs of this stool, most efficiently by training for a middle distance race. A lot of marathoners have really high lactate thresholds, but relatively low VO2 maxes. So, in other words, their lactate threshold and their VO2 max are kind of close to each other. And if you go and you undergo some testing and you find that, hey, that anaerobic threshold and then my VO2 max, my threshold is 95% of my VO2 max, which means they're really close to each other. That means you don't have a very high speed ceiling. And if you can drive that VO2 max up, you're then going to have the space to drive that lactate threshold even faster, which I would argue is one of the more important metrics for your marathon performance. So, yes, aerobic development is one of the most important, if not the most important aspect of your marathon fitness, but it is essentially a percentage of your maximum. If your maximum isn't very high, you've got to spend some time driving up that maximum. So go train for a 5K, go train for a 10K, get really fast, drive that VO2 up. You're going to improve your running economy, your muscle stiffness, and you're just going to become a much better runner. Because let's face it, running is running, right? Like you're training for a 5K, you're training for a marathon, you're still doing a lot of the same things. This is all very, very related. And if you're becoming a better runner by setting a 5K PR, well, you're just increasing the likelihood that that marathon PR is going to be more likely. So the first thing I would do is train for short events in the winter, spring, and the benefit of doing it then is that you're going from marathon training to something very different, and so you're getting a very different stimulus. you're turning all that endurance that you gained during marathon training into speed when you start doing those faster workouts. And by setting those PRs, you're driving up that ceiling. And I think it's easier to do this in the winter, because if you're
Mm-hmm.
racing mile, 2 mile, 5K races in the summer, the recipe for heat illness is going to be really, really good, because your heart rate is going to be much higher. You're going to be much more likely to, get heat stroke or something similar. You kind of want to avoid the really intense, brutal workouts and middle distance races in the heat of the summer. It's just it's just easier to do in the winter. And then for that, sort of in between season, that like spring, summer season, I might go to base training. And instead of trying to set 5K, 10K PRs, I would try to set training PRs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most people don't think about training PRs, do they? They think about whatever their finish times are. I like to think about, what's your highest weekly mileage? What's your highest monthly mileage? I think that's a better, longer term way of thinking about mileage. Um, did you ever get up to a 16 or 18-mile long run before the marathon season even starts? These are things you can do during a phase of base training before you even begin marathon training. And then you're just going to be in a much better position. You're going to be like, okay, well, I've set PRs in 5K, 8K, 10K, and I've just run more miles than I ever have in August. And I'm ready to start my marathon training, say in mid-August or something like that. And that's
Yeah.
just the recipe for a giant marathon PR if I've ever seen one.
Absolutely. If the athlete can stay healthy throughout the course of that season or that year, I 100% agree. I think it's really interesting when you shared about like the training PRs. I'm such a big believer in this for myself as an athlete when I'm on the track, and it could be like feeling strong, feeling smooth, running like new like training PRs. It can be the weekly mileage, the monthly mileage. And it does kind of help as you're going through a long cycle to be able to capture those wins, use them as momentum, use it as confidence to keep going, and to feel just really excited about what's to come. And I think that the speed in like after the marathon is such a good way to mix things up, change it up. I like to look at speed as like gears, and we want to make sure that we have all the gears. We want to have the easy, the long run, the marathon pace, the tempo, the threshold, the VO2 max. We want to have it all. We want to have all those gears so we can be able to tap into those. And after I coach an in-person group in Denver, and we've been in a very long summer season training for Boulderthon, which was a lot of 10K and half marathoners. And I'm coaching a lot of marathoners right now. And we're going into the fall group training season, which is the 5K. And I'm getting a lot of questions on why are we training the 5K? And I think it's such a cool way to take all the fitness that was built over the summer, training these longer distances and being able to shift into 5K mode. And last year it was really fun. It was a lot of fun. The team PR'd in December, and it sets, I think, everyone up for success going into the new year. So I absolutely love your strategies, and I'm a big believer in them, not just as a coach, but also for myself and like how I want to set up my next year of training. I think it's really important to know that marathon training is hard. And I don't think it's normalized enough online or with your running community or with your team that you're training with. It is hard. And if you're stacking marathon training cycle after marathon training cycle, it can be a recipe for burnout. It can be a recipe for injury. And you just kind of get stagnant in speed and you don't really get to move that needle. But if you can go back to racing or training for the mile, the 5K, the 10K, you're going to be much better off as you head into that next marathon. Jason, for someone who is maybe you had talked earlier about how the sport is getting faster, and we talked you talked about super shoes and coaching resources and fueling. I'm going to add in the smartwatches and the data that we get to have with our smartwatches. If an athlete doesn't have any of these things currently, but they are looking for a strong, like, breakthrough year in the coming 12 months, what would be the one thing out of these four things that you would like recommend them the most? Like, what's like the low hanging fruit here that's going to make the most impact?
Yeah, I think we can look at this as in terms of like the lowest hanging fruit and also the most effective. So, maybe the easiest thing to do is to get a pair of super shoes and just start experimenting
Mhm.
with them in training. Do a workout in them, maybe run a tune-up race in them and just see how your body responds to it and see if you're able to perform better in that pair of super shoes. Um, but probably the most effective strategy would be to hire the coach, because the coach can really help you with almost every other issue. They're going to help you look at your data in a way that is productive. They're going to tell you, "Hey, you should ignore that. You're stressing out about that one metric way too much and it doesn't matter as much." Or, "Hey, actually I noticed that, we have this thing going on here and I'd like to address it." I think, kind of going back to the last topic that we were talking about, sort of the annual plan, I think where the coach is arguably the most helpful is in figuring out what you are going to train for and when, and how you're going to recover and then get back to workouts. It's essentially managing your intensity and your focus throughout the year, because I think that is the thing that's going to give you the most results at the end of the day, is figuring out, okay, how should my training be structured? Should I be running higher volume but lower intensity, or higher intensity but lower volume? When should I be doing that? The coach just sort of takes all that off your plate. They're going to give you a whole strategy that is not only like what is likely considered, a best case scenario or ideal best practices. But they're also going to listen to the athlete and give them training that they're excited by. I have some runners that, are not really excited about marathon training, but we can still build their aerobic fitness in a lot of other ways. And so the coach, I think, is the best resource. They're going to be able to help you with fueling, with deciphering all those metrics, with helping you focus on the right thing at the right time. So for any runner who really wants to potentially discover what they are capable of as an athlete, I think a coach is an indispensable resource.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that for sure because we as coaches can absolutely help athletes in a myriad of ways, and the planning aspect is such a big component to a successful athlete and a successful runner. I love the athletes who come to me with their year plan, their 3-year plan, their 5-year plan of like where I want to go in this sport, because it makes it, at least in my world, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of plan the next 12 months of knowing exactly where the athlete wants to eventually get to. And it's also really exciting. So the athlete who's looking to be cute, they have the coach, they're going into a season of speed, maybe translating to off season before marathon season, but they're also looking to pick the best race possible. What are some things that they should look at to help them achieve this BQ time?
Yeah, so if they're looking for, a fast race, it depends on what season they're in. So are they choosing a fast marathon course, or are they choosing fast races for, that season of speed?
Yeah, I think it'll be the marathon. Like, what are they looking for in the marathon?
Yeah. So for the marathon, number one, you want to make sure that it's an actual USA Track and Field certified course that, is eligible for a Boston Marathon qualifying time. Because there are
Yeah.
some races that are not actual real races. They're sort of more community fun runs. And that's not where you should be spending your effort, because if you race a marathon and it's not a certified course, you're going to have to recover from that marathon and the time technically doesn't count. So we want to avoid that scenario. So as long as it's a certified course, the number one thing I would look at is how flat it is. So are you experiencing a lot of hills? My PR is at the Philadelphia Marathon, which does have some hills. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
fastest course. I think if I was going pure speed, I would probably want to race a Chicago Marathon, Berlin Marathon. Um, I think Grandma's and Wine Glass are also two flat and fast marathons, but please fact check me on that, guys. I haven't raced those two, but a lot of folks have posted some really good times on those courses. Uh, CIM is not the flattest course, but for some reason, I don't know, maybe it's the weather. They post a lot of really fast times. It's a high PR and Boston qualifying type of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing that I would look at is the weather on race day. I've got a friend that says, in the heat, I don't compete. And it's just because,
Same.
yeah, like if it's over 60 degrees, I mean, really, if it's over 55 degrees, your marathon performance is going to be slower than it could have been. So even if it's, if you have your family and friends who are going to be spectating and they're excited about the weather on race day, that's probably a bad sign, because what's good for the spectator is not good for the athlete. You probably want a race that is in the 37 to high 40s degree range. So that is a little bit chilly, but that I think is the range where you're not going to be building up so much heat that it starts to increase your core body temperature and you start to slow down. So Chicago can be okay in this regard, although it has been a little bit warmer, at the very beginning of October. I think we're
Mm-hmm.
recording this 10 days before the Chicago Marathon. So that one can be a little bit iffy. Um,
Yeah.
you also have the Philadelphia Marathon, which I think is late November. It's not the flattest course, but you're probably going to get really good weather during that race. So it's a little bit of this balancing act of choosing a flat marathon that is going to be cool on race day, that doesn't have a lot of hills. Another thing that you can look at is just the type of race. So I have run a double out and back marathon before, which I don't recommend, because
Yeah.
number one, it is psychologically boring as all hell. Like you're just sitting there, you're like, oh my God, you're just going back and forth on this one course. And it really does a number on your mindset. But you're also doing a lot of these 180-degree turns where you have to slow down out of marathon pace, go around a cone or something like that, and then you have to accelerate back into marathon pace. And if there's a lot of those kinds of turns or 90-degree turns, I think this is maybe more important in a shorter race. But I always felt that it really took the wind out of my sails when I was
Mm-hmm.
racing any kind of race. And that's something to look at, although I would say that's not as important as the type of course and the weather on race day.
Yeah, those are all really great points. Grandma's and Wine Glass are hilly, kind of like CIM, snappy hills, but it's net downhill. So it can be fast. Both of these races can be extremely fast, but it all depends, I think, on the strength of the runner and what they're capable of doing. I think CIM does have that rap of being a really like fast course. It's a BQ course. It might be like the course that has the most BQ times, but it is hilly in the first 13.1, very snappy hills, and then it flattens out. And you have to be ready for that because it is, your body feels a certain way once you start running flat or net downhill, and you have to be ready for it. So definitely research the course, choose a course that really lends itself well to your strengths. I'm a big believer in that. And I'm only racing flat and fast courses from here on out. Um, and I think, yeah, it's going to be a really exciting time for this fall. Looking at Chicago here in 10 days, their weather does look a little warm right now, but hopefully it cools off. And I love that, like, 37, 38 degrees on race morning. I've had one race in that like area, and that was the Houston half in 2022. And I ran like this breakthrough half marathon. And it was cold, but it felt really good once you warm up and you're going. So definitely take a look at the weather too. I think it's a really huge, big aspect to racing well.
I also think that the hills on the course and the weather on race day, those are the two most important things, and everything else is just window dressing. It doesn't really matter too much. Like I mentioned, turns that can matter a little bit, but it's so much better just to get in really amazing shape so that you have to worry less and less about all these little obstacles in your way because you're going to get that BQ no matter what. So drive that
Yeah.
5K time down, drive those short distance times down. Like Sarah, if your half marathon time was 72 minutes, you probably wouldn't have a problem breaking 3 hours in the marathon, even if it was a relatively hilly course. So it's just
Hmm.
a fun way of looking at it. Like you can run a much faster marathon by racing a whole bunch of 5Ks and getting really fast in the 5K. And then, oh wow, I'm now the type of runner who can qualify for Boston because the equivalent performance in the 5K shows that I can. And the great thing about those middle distance races is that if it doesn't go well, you can race another one the following weekend. You don't need to recover for weeks like you do after a marathon. So you can just give yourself this incredible exposure to middle distance races just by racing 5Ks and 8Ks and 10Ks. And you can race 6 or 8 of them over the course of a 10-week race phase of your season. And at that point, you are just going to be so steeled to the discomfort of racing, and you're going to be able to fine tune your pacing approach. I think racing is a skill. And if you get really good at it in the shorter events where you have more opportunities to get good at it, your marathon is just going to take care of itself.
That sounds great. We want our 26.2 to feel a little bit easier, right? Um, what makes a Boston Marathon special to you?
Well, I think part of the reason is because of the history behind it. I think it's one of the
Mhm.
world's oldest marathons. I think the first running of the Boston Marathon was in the 19th century. So we are now spanning 3 different centuries of racing the Boston Marathon. And I think that's really cool. That's something special. I think another reason why Boston is special is because it's hard to get into, because there's a qualifying standard, because you don't get in just because you won the lottery or, you've waited in line patiently. It doesn't work like that. This is almost like the US Olympic trials for amateurs.
Yeah,
Like every sub elite or elite runner wants to qualify for the Olympic trials, and every amateur runner wants to qualify for the Boston Marathon. And it sort of is this kind of cold calculation where you either run the time or you don't. And that's a little bit hard for some runners to wrap their heads around, but I actually
mhm.
love that because it's objective, and I think it's the fairest route to a sporting event. I mean, that's essentially what it is, right? Let's not forget that this is a sport, and in a sport where we literally rank people from fastest to slowest, a one race that celebrates performance out of anything else, I think is special and it makes it unique. And for most runners, we start thinking about getting that Boston qualifying standard and racing through the streets of Boston. And that is a very special reward to experience the history of Boston. But more importantly is to know that you qualified for it. Yes, you can raise a bunch of money and kind of buy your way in through charity, but I don't think that's as special as earning that qualifying standard and then having that medal around your neck, knowing that you hit that time and that you got in the hard way. I think there's something special about that.
Definitely. I agree with that. And from experience of running it twice, it feels really good to know like you earned your spot to run this course, and it's a really exciting weekend to really celebrate all the hard work and everything that you and maybe anyone else that you're there with running have accomplished to get there. And for anyone who is maybe on that cusp of qualifying, or maybe you have some significant time to take off, if you can continue to show up and be consistent and take Jason's advice and work on speed in the winter, have an off season, like really be intentional with your training, you'll eventually get there. And when you get there, it's even going to make it that much more special. Like it's just going to feel so much better knowing you had to like work for it and really put in the time, and it's going to be a great experience. I have a quick funny story to share. For the first Boston that I ran, it was in 2021, and I didn't see this in 2023, so I don't know if it was because of the pandemic year, but my sister and a good friend went with me, and we flew in. The Boston Marathon's on a Monday, so I think we flew in on a Saturday afternoon. And once we landed, I said, I want to go to the expo. I want to get the jacket. Like, I want that experience today, knowing like Sunday, I want to be like off my feet and really just try and decompress before the race on Monday. And so we went to the expo. I got the jacket. I picked up my bib, all these great things. And we're walking on the streets, like from the expo to like dinner. And there are kiosks like set up, or like little like vendor like stations, and they were selling the jacket on the street. And like anyone could have walked up to buy this jacket. And my sister was joking with me, and she's like, I should buy the jacket and just like rock this thing, and people will think I ran it. And I'm like, yeah, but you didn't. And I'm going to know that I did. And, it makes it special. So kind of funny. I don't know exactly if that happened in other years, but it definitely was a thing in 2021.
Yeah, I didn't notice that when I ran it in 2014. So that was 10 years ago now. But that, yeah, that it's both like kind of funny, but also if you don't earn it, like what's the point?
Yeah. Like, don't buy that jacket.
I do like that your sister was trolling you though. That's great.
She's good for that. Jason, is there anything else that you want to share with the audience today?
I want to share that qualifying for Boston is an advanced goal. For the amateur
Mm.
runner, it's like getting your PhD. So don't skip elementary school, don't skip middle school and high school. Take your AP classes. And what does that mean? For this analogy, it means focus on shorter races first. Everyone loves to talk about Eliud Kipchoge, the marathoner, but few recognize that he was a middle distance runner first. He has one of the fastest 3,000-meter times in history. I think he's in the top 10. He's only good at the marathon because he drove up his speed ceiling first. I didn't start running until more than 10 years, or I'm sorry, I didn't start racing marathons until more than 10 years after I started running. And I needed that. I needed to get fast. I needed to build my capacity for higher mileage training. I needed to get comfortable with some of those longer long runs. And you can be kind of training for a marathon, even if you never race a marathon, just by training for the shorter events first. And so don't get your head wrapped too much around a fast 26.2-mile race, which is very hard. I mean, it requires very advanced physiology to do that. And you don't get that in a season or two or three or four. You really are only able to express your potential in a marathon after consistent years of training. And that's at least 5, but probably closer to 10. And so I would definitely recommend runners recognize that it is a very advanced goal to qualify for Boston, and don't roll off the couch and try to go after that goal, in your first 6 months of running. Let's build up some of your capacities first, work on getting faster in the shorter races, because that's going to drive up all those physiological numbers that are going to be important to a fast marathon. And it's just an easier way of doing it. And you're going to be a lot more excited about the journey if you're just setting constant 5K, 10K, mile, 10-mile, half marathon PRs. If you're setting PRs every season in one or two of those events, you're going to be so excited about your training that when the time comes to run a marathon, you're going to be so much faster than if you had tried to run a marathon after only training for, say, 18 months.
Yeah, that's great advice. I had a 12-year span from when I first started running to my first marathon. And it was when I ran a half marathon at an hour and 39 minutes in trainers. I thought, oh, I could actually take this to 26.2 and do something special with it. So I think patience, like we talked about earlier in this episode, is such a good thing to have as you get into this, and be proud of yourself too for how you're showing up, what you're doing in the moment, and give yourself time and patience. Um,
Patience. It's the magic ingredient.
it is. It is. Jason, where can the Elevate audience connect with you online?
Well, strengthrunning.com is my home base. That's where you can find all of our different training programs, our award winning blog, as well as our free email courses where we teach you about different topics like injury prevention or weightlifting for runners. But you can also check out the Strength Running podcast, available anywhere. Or if you prefer video, we are also just at Strength Running on YouTube.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Bye, everyone. I'll see you again next week.